statements coming out at various levels of the leadership. Of course, the worst relations in recent memory were when President Nixon was in the White House and he had a deep antipathy for Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and they sent parts of the US Seventh Fleet into the Indian Ocean, into the Bay of Bengal, to try and blackmail India. Let it not be said that one person did so much to destroy a relationship which had so much promise. History would not judge Mr. Trump kindly if that is the verdict of the present generation. And I think a special envoy from the Prime Minister to President Trump's administration, and hopefully a reciprocal gesture by President Trump, would perhaps be a beginning.
Hello and welcome to the Times of India. I'm Neha Khanna, and we're now joined by a special guest. We have with us Professor Amitabh Mattoo, one of India's most renowned and respected thinkers and writers on international relations. He is Dean and Professor at the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University here in New Delhi. Professor Mattoo, welcome to Times of India. Great to have you with us.
A great pleasure, Neha, and I'm looking forward to the interview.
Thank you so much for your time. Now, let's start with the most talked about subject these days. All you hear about are Trump tariffs, 50% tariffs on India, and daily insults hurled by Trump and his cabinet, especially his trade advisor, Peter Navarro. Dead economy, Modi's war, India is a laundromat for the Kremlin. They seem to be on a warpath with India. Is this the lowest point in the India-US relationship in 25 years since the sanctions that were imposed on India in 1998 following our nuclear tests? What's your view?
I think they are pretty bad. I don't remember relations really being quite as bad, and particularly at the individual leadership level, or at least in terms of the statements coming out at various levels of the leadership. Of course, the worst relations in recent memory were when President Nixon was in the White House and he had a deep antipathy for Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and they sent parts of the U.S. Seventh Fleet into the Indian Ocean, into the Bay of Bengal, to try and blackmail India in not actually carrying out the action that we did, which led to the liberation of Bangladesh. But 1998 was the other time when we had bad relations. But even there, Clinton sent one of his closest friends, Strobe Talbot, to New Delhi to negotiate a way out, or find a modus vivendi with Jaswant Singh. So even though they imposed sanctions, which were automatic, we knew that there were going to be sanctions if we tested, because that was part of the US policy. But even then, I don't think relations were really had dipped so low, because you have a trade advisor who frankly seems completely out of control in terms of the stream or the volley of messages, which are personally disrespectful to the Prime Minister and certainly show a complete lack of empathy for India and its interests.
No two ways about it. Professor Mattoo, the Trump administration is trying to squeeze India to get Putin to end the war in Ukraine. We are being held responsible for someone else's actions. They're now even calling it Modi's war. How do we deal with the United States at this point in time? Isn't Trump treating India almost like an enemy?
It's quite surreal, given that, of course, he before he sanctions India or before he makes any kind of a diatribe against India, he always talks about the Prime Minister as a great leader, as a terrific person, including his trade advisor. But on the other hand, what they're doing is really designed to almost alienate India, to create the conditions of a hostile India. And so it is surreal, and it is surreal also because China and the European Union are the biggest importers of Russian oil, and they don't face sanctions. India has been sanctioned, been given the secondary tariffs of 25%, when they're amongst a score of other countries which imports Russian oil. So it is bizarre. It's telling perhaps of a lack of insensitivity. Some people attribute it to President Trump's own sense of slight, or that he was not given the recognition that he felt he needed after, or need to be given after the Operation Sindoor, because in his imagination he was responsible for the ceasefire. But that's not the manner in which the Indian narrative has been presented, and the manner in which we read the narrative is that the US did put pressure on Pakistan to see good sense, but certainly the ceasefire was a bilateral arrangement agreed upon by the two director generals of military operations.
So let's expand on that a little bit. The Democrats said just yesterday it seems like it's not about Ukraine at all. And many believe it's not about trade or Russian oil. As you mentioned, it is personal pique and a bruised ego that seem to be driving Trump's actions towards India. As you said, possibly India's refusal to give Trump credit for the ceasefire with Pakistan. Do you believe that is what largely explains Trump's intense and sudden hostility towards India?
Yeah, one would like to imagine that when you are the president of the United States of America, which is the most powerful position, executive position in in the world, saves perhaps President Xi of China, you assume that there's a certain sense of humility, a certain sense of your place in the world, and that you would act more maturely, and will not be take personal or even perceived personal slights in a manner which is disproportionate to the interests of your bilateral relationship and to the interests of the country. However, President Trump obviously has a very sensitive persona, and which has even grown more sensitive from after being in office, and has a view of himself as a larger than life personality. And somehow, I don't know what's driven him, given that he does not really subject himself to the orthodoxies of the past. So he doesn't believe in the media or the traditional mainstream media, but he certainly seems to attach great value to the Nobel Peace Prize. And that India did not nominate him, and of course, Pakistan or individuals within Pakistan and every second country has to genuflect before him and say, "You deserve the Nobel Prize." That somehow he feels that India is not recognizing this larger than life personality of Trump, and he's felt personally offended. Some others say that perhaps Prime Minister Modi should have met him during the campaign, but that's not proper. That's not correct. I mean, if there is a presidential campaign running, uh, you can't then identify yourself with any single individual. So, frankly, it is bizarre. I mean, I think we need to contact perhaps someone, a qualified therapist, to figure out why he's felt so offended, because there is really no reason, no rational reason. So and I can't imagine myself, usually, as an academic, one of your training is to put yourself into your adversary's position or into the other person's position. Try and think like him, think like her, and then decide what the world would look like. But there's no way I can put myself in President Trump's position and justify what he is doing, if indeed he's doing it on personal grounds. Now, people say, then if it's so small and trivial, why doesn't India say that that we'll nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, because it's very unlikely that he'll get the Nobel Peace Prize, and it will bring us brownies from the Trump administration. But that's not the way India functions. That's not what the Indian civilization is all about. This is not. This is a self-respecting nation. It's not a banana republic. We cannot see ourselves see ourselves, and in terms of our self-perception and the way in which the world sees us, as being subjected to the whims and fancies of one irrational leader in the United States. So it is a difficult situation. It is a paradoxical situation, because in some ways the easiest way is to bloat Trump's oversized ego, But that's not something which India will do readily or easily.
And we certainly seem to have earned his ire for that reason. Now, Professor Matu, this is being seen as a complete breakdown in the India US relationship and the Modi Trump equation. During Trump's first term, the two leaders seemed to get along like a house on fire. Now, if I asked you, what do you think has gone so horribly wrong this time around? Again, is it all about not getting credit for the ceasefire with Pakistan? Is it all about not being nominated for a Nobel? Or is it that Prime Minister Modi refused to meet him during his campaign? How do you explain the complete breakdown of ties even between the two leaders?
I think it's a combination of various factors, but I wouldn't say that the bilateral equation between the two leaders has broken down. There's a gulf, but in some ways, that is still a card that has not been played. That I think there is still hope because the chemistry between the two leaders in the past, from Namaste Trump to Howdy Modi, was reflected not just in the crowds in Houston and in Ahmedabad, but also in the personal warmth which came through very strongly during those two rallies. So I think that is a relationship which can still be rescued. And in some ways, that's why, although it seems a odd choice of the new US ambassador to India, Sergio Gore, in again, in paradoxical terms, he might be the right answer at this time because he is a confidant. He's not a diplomat. He has no diplomatic experience. He doesn't have any diplomatic baggage. What he does enjoy is a complete confidence and trust of President Trump. And if he can communicate with New Delhi with the with that sense of confidence and take back from Prime Minister Modi a clear message, perhaps there could be a breakthrough.
You know, it's interesting you talk about Sergio Gore. There's been a lot of speculation about why he's been picked by Trump. There is no doubt that he's a hardcore MAGA loyalist and part of Trump's inner circle. However, there is considerable concern here in New Delhi over his dual role because he's also been sort of nominated to be America's special envoy for South and Central Asia. And many are now wondering, is this Trump trying to rehyphenate India and Pakistan? How do you look at it?
Again, it's too early to say. I would rather take a more optimistic view that in some ways, uh, appointing him both as an envoy to India as well as giving him this special role for South and Central Asia means it's pivoting towards India and recognizing the centrality of India within the region. Because if he makes the mistake of being thinking of himself as a Richard Holbrooke, who was appointed by President Obama in a similar role and thought that he could mediate within the region, he'll be making the gravest mistake. He'll find India uh, completely cool down to him. The relations will be extremely frosty. And Holbrooke at least had a stellar diplomatic career to as part of the baggage that he brought. Gore has nothing except the fact that he is a trusted confidant and a political operative, successful as that. So he will immediately alienate the Indian foreign policy establishment if he tries to take that extra territorial role as a third party mediator. If he is here just to recognize de facto India's centrality to the wider region, he's welcome. If he's trying to pretend to be another Richard Holbrooke, he'll find that Roosevelt House will be a place where few will really visit during his tenure as ambassador.
Let's certainly hope it doesn't come to that. Let me ask you this, Professor Mattu. One, can there still be an India US trade deal? Two, do you believe Prime Minister Modi and President Trump could still meet on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly next month to iron out some of the differences? Or does that now seem rather unlikely given how things have spun out of control?
I think there is still hope for this relationship. I'm not one of those who's given up. I think it's important that India does diversify, hedge in terms of other relationships as well, reaches out as it does, as it's been doing to Moscow and China. But I think this relationship is critical. Remember, we are the oldest and the largest democracies with so much to share. And frankly speaking, in all candor, great other relationships are important, but no other relationship can give you the same access to global influence, as well be as important in terms of trade, technology, and even cutting edge defense. What I would suggest might be an answer, or a possible answer, is perhaps if in the interim Prime Minister Modi would appoint a special envoy, and hope that President Trump can do that, even while Gore's confirmation is going through the tortuous process within the Senate. And while they do not undermine their respective ambassadors, or in this case, just charge their affairs in Washington, D.C. and in New Delhi, but these are people who enjoy the complete confidence of, in this case, the Indian Prime Minister, for instance, and are dedicated to actually just do the reaching out and try and iron out the differences. Now, this is not a recipe for success. This is not a quick mantra which might work, but I think this still holds a possibility of establishing a dedicated channel where, if there are some degree of affronts that can be smoothed out, or if someone is feeling hurt about, or has individual, or they have individual grievances or leadership grievances, those can be ironed out, and perhaps you can find a pathway ahead, because otherwise this is a destructive course. And while India might bear the immediate costs, the long term costs of this happening will be far graver for the United States of America, not just in terms of the manner in which their leadership will decline, but also in terms of their own economy, in terms of the bilateral relationship, which is important. After all, you have a 5 million strong diaspora of Indians who contribute so much to the US economy. The vice president's own wife is from as part of that diaspora, which has contributed so much. So, apart from that, even in other areas, I think the US has a great deal to learn, and as well as to take from the India relationship, because the impression that the Trump White House is giving is that we don't need you. That's a false illusion. If anyone has convinced President Trump that India is not needed for them to engage with Asia, for them to establish their relations with China, or indeed Russia, or the other Asian powers, they're mistaken. They're falsely mistaken, and it's a really dangerous course for American foreign policy to follow.
Wish somebody would tell Donald Trump that. Now, under Trump, the US has proved to be a highly unreliable ally. You know, his actions have caused tremendous anger and resentment in India, as you're well aware. And many believe that the trust deficit could actually take years to bridge. Do you agree with that? And will we have to wait till the end of the Trump presidency before we see the derailed relationship coming back on track? Because frankly, that's how many are looking at it now.
Dennis Cox, diplomatic historian, wrote this great book called Estranged Democracies, which talked about how two countries with such shared values were not able to see eye to eye with each other right through the Cold War, even though President Roosevelt was a great champion for Indian independence. But soon after that, whether it was the Eisenhower administration, or whether it was the Kennedy administration, or Lyndon Johnson, then of course Nixon was the worst. That you had a relationship which remained, in some ways, didn't fulfill the promise that everyone saw in it. And then it took about 10 years after the nuclear tests and the nuclear deal under Bush, George W. Bush, for the relationship to really flower. Now, anti Americanism is part of the DNA of India, because we are, by nature, are people who react strongly to imperialist, or what we see is imperialist powers, and as powers who try and dictate to the rest of the world the way the world should be run, because that's against our own ethos of, in a sense, Atam Nirbharata, a strategic autonomy translated into a kind of ancient philosophy. Now, if after all that has been overcome over these years, because of the diaspora, because of the strong relationship, and because of the decline of the other friends, if that's were to go back to what it was in the 60s and the 70s, I'm afraid it'll take a generation. You're right. For to recover India, because if Trump loses India, for the next 15 years, you'll or 20 years, every successive president will try very hard. It's not easy to regain the trust of a country and a civilization like India once lost. And India is will be pay the short term price for it, but in the long term, it will realize that the relationship of with the United States was built really on false promises, was built on a foundation which was very shaky.
As I keep saying,
You
let's
know,
hope.
Henry Kissinger.
Yes,
Sorry, I was just on to Henry Kissinger said, being being a enemy of, the once quoted thing, being an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but being a friend is fatal.
fatal.
So I mean that's yeah that again will be an adage which will be quoted again and again within the Indian narrative.
You know,
There is still a strong lobby within India, within think tanks, within economic interests, a strong lobby for the United States.
yes.
There's been but those will fade away like the morning dew once this relationship breaks down. And if visas are going to be an issue, immigration is going to be an issue, students can't travel there, then even the people to people warmth will really vaporize.
Well, unfortunately, through his actions, Trump seems to have proven Henry Kissinger right. Now, he's chosen to punish India with his tariffs, but is clearly going soft on China. We can all see that. China, which is the largest buyer of Russian oil. Do you agree with those, Professor Mattoo, who say it's because China has tremendous leverage over the United States, which India doesn't? And what do you think is the way forward for India in that case? I know you mentioned perhaps the appointment of a special envoy could be one step in that direction. But how do you deal with that situation, really, or this reality?
Yes, it is a fact that India is not China in terms of economic or military muscle today. But if the Trump administration has decided to concede Asia to China, it's a dangerous and a very short term strategy. After all, the next big challenge will be China moving uh, from hegemonizing Asia to try and hegemonize the world. That's the way China is moving. So if America is now willing to concede the rest of the world to China, then it's a different issue altogether. But if they believe that there is a need to balance China, not contain China, you have to have that relationship of engagement, but balance China so that it does not become hegemonistic, that it doesn't become belligerent, that there is a certain degree of moderation in its actions, then India is vital. There is no way that you can balance China in Asia unless you do it through mechanisms like the Quad, for instance. And that's why it's important why Prime Minister Modi went to Japan as well. Um, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States trying to find a balance in which China has a role to play. China has a place, but not a hegemonic space, not as a hegemonic power, but as another great power whose interests will always find place, but whose hegemonic aspirations will be contained. Now, as I
Okay.
said,
Yes, go ahead, sir.
he should not bind America of tomorrow to his short-term transactional considerations. President Trump will not succeed in either making America great again. He'll just make the world much unsafer for people and for countries. So he'll have just fail in his domestic mission while leading to a complete sense of instability and anarchy in the international system.
Well, I think anarchy describes it perfectly because that really is what Trump seems to have unleashed on the world. And I want to talk about the China factor in greater detail with you in just a moment. Before that, I want to draw your attention to, this article that's been carried by The Economist, which says, and I quote, it's unusual to experience humiliation, vindication, and a defining test all at the same time. For America to alienate India is an epic mistake. For India, it's a moment of opportunity, a defining test of its claim to be a superpower in waiting. I wonder what you think about this.
One surprising factor, and this surprised me as someone who's a close observer of international relations, how much of the mainstream Western media has been pointing out what a disastrous mistake Trump is making with India, and how it is in its India policy. He's shaking the foundations of a relationship which took 20 years to build. And they know that India will not take this slight easily, because once they have decided that this relationship is not worth pursuing, they will follow their own path. And they will follow their own path with steadfastness. Of course, there will be question marks like one which the economists raise. Can you do it on your own? Can you really be a Atmanirbhar in the real sense of the word when the United States has decided to so-called punish you? And it is the strongest economic and military power in the globe today. But India has a resilience. We've defied superpowers. We've had virtually no relations with the United States for a long time. During the 60s and 70s, during Mrs. Gandhi's period, there was hardly a relationship worth calling. So we can go back to those times. It is now for all those who are interested in this relationship, including the diaspora. The diaspora needs to walk the talk, because, after all, we always have believed that that's one of our strongest cementing bonds. But where are today the Sundar Pichais and the Satya Nadellas and the Vinod Khoslas, and all those who have a stake in this relationship, or Usha Vance, and all the vice presidential or presidential hopefuls who, I think it's for them now to try and stand up and say, Mr. Trump, you are making a mistake, not just for yourself, not just for the Republican Party, but for the American people. And this is a mistake that will have consequences for at least 20 years. Do not do that. Your tenure is only for the next 3.5 years at best. But do not commit the American people, the United States of America, to this course of action for 15, 16 more years.
I think that's a very interesting point that you've made, because many have asked that question in the last few days. Why is the Indian diaspora silent on this, especially some of the most prominent voices, some of whom you just mentioned? Coming back to the China angle to all of this. For a long time, Professor Mattu, the Americans saw India as a counterweight to its biggest adversary, like you said, an expansionist and hegemonic China in the Indo Pacific and also in the economic sphere. Trump has turned that policy on its head. Hasn't he played right into China's hands and scored an own goal? Or is he simply not thinking through any of it?
Yeah, as I said, he doesn't seem to, and I hope I'm wrong, because I don't want to be disrespectful to the President of the United States, particularly because a leadership position like that needs to be respected, that he's not thought through. I mean, it's important for the President and his advisors to think through a problem and game it completely. The fact is that it will lead to a new proximity between Beijing and Delhi, and that relationship, once established, will have its own rules of the game. And quite clearly, one of the rules will be that India will stop pitching for the United States as its strongest partner, and stop pitching for the United States to have an extra geographical role in Asia. Because from the Chinese point of view, those are vital. That India does not fall into the US's arms, and that US does not have a kind of NATO-like alliance within Asia. And if India commits to that course of action, if it will happen if Trump keeps on, or American foreign policy keeps on this course of alienating India, it will have consequences for even the United States' relationship with China. Forget the US's role in Asia. If the, Mr. Trump believes that in somehow he can arrive at a modus vivendi with China, that together they will rule the world, he's living in some fantasy land. And sometimes I suspect that most of the times he seems to occupy that space and not the space of reality. But also, as I said, Neha, It's important for all those who are championing Indian interests and Indian capital, which gains so much from American free enterprise, the American market, or even which has gained so much from what people say is price arbitrage on the uh, on oil. I think uh, they need to actually also raise the bar in terms of reaching out to actors and stakeholders within America, particularly within the Trump administration, and driving good sense into them. After all, there are very powerful actors within India who have deep interests in the United States and who have in some ways, far greater influence in the United States than the machinery of the Indian government. And those big businesses need to now get their act together. They need to really demonstrate that not only have would their interests be compromised if this relationship were to break down, but that they have the interests of India at the bottom of their heart. Because this is the time to speak up for India. This is the time to speak up for the country and the civilization that has given these big businesses, these corporate honchos, all the leverage.
Couldn't agree more with you, Professor Mattoo. Now, let me ask you this. You referred to this earlier. Thanks to Trump, we are seeing an unmistakable shift in global geopolitics. There is a thaw in India China ties. Prime Minister Modi is traveling to China, as we know, for the SCO summit over the weekend. And he will hold bilateral talks with President Xi Jinping on Sunday. What can we expect?
I think if there is a quiet dialogue which actually recognizes the importance of India and China, at least having a modicum of stability in their bilateral relationship, and expressing concern about the manner in which relations have been, in some ways, undermined over the last few years. That's a good beginning. I wouldn't want, I don't expect, I wouldn't really want something which is startling or surprising or shocking, just a polite conversation because that conversation is taking place after 7 years. So, not a breakthrough moment, but a moment of candor which could give us hope that this relationship will, from here onwards, will be on even keel. Remember, we the prime minister and the president are also meeting after Operation Sindoor, where there was an unprecedented collaboration between China and Pakistan.
Yeah, yeah.
We are going to China in difficult circumstances. These are not the easiest of times, and China understands every nuance of diplomacy and international diplomacy. But if they are willing to give us the space and we are willing to also concede some space to Beijing, then perhaps that is the path we need to follow in the next few months. We need to refocus and re energize our relationships towards other countries other than the United States. Let's face it, many of us who have been guilty within the media, within academia, within the larger foreign policy establishment for disproportionately focusing on the United States. I think we need to now uh, really position that relationship with the United States exactly where it stands today, give it a sense of its of how, in some ways, how it might matter in a larger sense, but how little it counts in terms of the Indian imagination or possibilities that are open to us if we have to go down the way of downscaling ties with Washington.
You know, it's hard to believe that it wasn't too long ago when President Biden and Prime Minister Modi met at the White House, and President Biden said that the India US relationship was the defining partnership of the 21st century. And look where we are today. Now, you know, I think we all agree that Trump has pushed India closer to both Russia and China. Is that how you look at it as well, Professor Mattoo? Has he reinvigorated the RIC axis, for instance, and infused fresh life even into BRICS, an alliance that he so loves to hate?
Unfortunately, this is what is ironical, is that while it may to be early to say in terms of institutions, whether it's the RIC, framework or the BRICS framework, President Trump has succeeded in uh, getting countries to do exactly what he didn't want them to do. And in some ways, let it not be said, and this is really reaching out to the president himself from your channel, from your medium, is let it not be said that one person did so much to destroy a relationship which had so much promise. History would not judge Mr. Trump kindly if that is the verdict of the present generation. I think but I still feel that it's not beyond redemption. I think the relationship is not beyond hope. It needs to be rescued. It needs to be rescued in a manner in which perhaps we need to give it that last push. And I think special envoy from the Prime Minister to President Trump's administration, and hopefully a reciprocal gesture by President Trump, would perhaps be a beginning. Doesn't mean that it'll be a success, but at least at the end of the day, no one will regret the fact that we did not try and rescue this relationship. And if there was just a question of President Trump's personal ego being bruised, we sent a special envoy to tell him, calm down, it's all right. We recognize you, we respect you, but this is India, 5,000 years, um, civilization, much before America was born, as even a dream in some uh, native Indians' fantasy. It was India has lived through turmoil, turbulence, rise and fall, and it's seen it all. This is just not even a chapter. This is a page in the history of India.
It most certainly is. You know, there was recently this German newspaper report that claimed that Trump had made multiple calls to Prime Minister Modi, but the latter ignored those calls, and that it's all happened in the last few weeks. I don't know what the truth is. There's absolutely no confirmation of that from any government source here in New Delhi. What did you make of that story?
I think, again, no confirmation, nothing that I know which uh, uh, could corroborate that report. However, the fact that the Prime Minister wanted to demonstrate that this is not, that he's not waiting for the phone to ring and answer it the moment President Trump calls him. India is a different country. India is exceptional in a world which does not recognize exceptionalism beyond a point, especially when you take a realist view of the world. All great powers behave alike. But India has a sense of its own self. The Prime Minister has a sense of his own destiny. And if he didn't take that call, I think good for India. Well done. I'm even prouder than I was uh, before the Trump saga began. But I do hope, in any case, that there is a telephonic conversation, because I think that personal chemistry can be revived. But if it requires a special envoy, let's appoint one quickly at that.
I think that's great advice, Professor Mattu, and I certainly hope that the government of India is listening to your advice. But you know, going back to the India-China relationship for a moment, how do you resolve the trust deficit that exists between India and China? Major concerns still remain: the border dispute, China sitting on our territory, the Galwan clashes, and as you mentioned, China's support to Pakistan during Operation Sindoor. How do you think India should reconcile all of that with this new geopolitical reality that we're now faced with?
See, there are three visions of India's China relationship. One was born out of the kind of Nehruvian idealism, which thought that two Asian great powers becoming independent after a century and a half or 2 centuries of Western humiliation would together provide leadership to the world. That was a naive, idealistic view which was shattered after the 62 Sino Indian War. Then there was another view of China which says that, which is the realist view, that look at two powers anywhere across history in any geography, they inevitably clash as they rise. And China has risen, India is rising, that China will always want to box in India into South Asia, and that's why it's using Pakistan as a proxy to box us in. That's the third view, is the view which I would subscribe to, that yes, there will always be bilateral issues and there will be historic, in terms of the history and the future, contradictions about China and India rising together, or China having risen, as I said, India catching up. But there are ways, pragmatic paths that you can construct where both can find space, where you can have a relationship of engagement without the relationship being so brittle as that you will have clashes like the one that had happened, say, in Galwan. For that, you require leadership and you require sustained confidence building measures and channels of communication open throughout. So I think if Xi Jinping has come to the conclusion that, look, neither is an idealist view nor is a view that the inevitability of conflict theory will prevail, then a middle way in which India and China reconcile and find space for each other, and recognize also that perhaps Asia is best run, if you would like to call it that, although that seems like an imperialist patronizing term, that, that Asia is best managed by Asian powers to the exclusion of powers like the United States, then perhaps that's the pathway ahead. Because America has demonstrated, at least in the last few months, a complete lack of responsibility for pursuing its long term interests or the interests of its allies. If America is driving down a road on a suicidal with a suicidal speed, then it's best to avoid collision with the America, which is on this course. It's best kept away from shaping the destiny or the future of Asia. Uh, but this is a conversation which the Prime Minister and President need to have. Or again, it need not be zero sum. You can find even a space if President Trump were to recognize his own follies, short term follies. Perhaps you could find the space for a role in of the United States, not as a security provider, but in a sense, a player which has its own interests, which will also help shape the future of Asia, but through a concord between all these three countries in a way that will ensure the peace and prosperity in Asia for the years to come.
You know, right now that just sounds so utopian given the ground realities we're faced with. Trump has dealt a big blow even to the Quad, Professor Mattu. Some are beginning to wonder if it's still relevant. How significant is Prime Minister Modi's visit to Japan ahead of his China trip? Does it signal a balancing of its geopolitical interests by India?
Prime Minister Modi has had always had a special personal relationship with Japan, going back to the time that he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and he had this deep bonding with Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister, one of the great leaders of Japan. So I think there it was important for him to go there, but in the present context, given that Japan is perhaps pulling out of the so-called trade agreement with the United States as well, there's common concern. Fact is that Trump has caused so much chaos that you can find virtually any country in the world today to have a common conversation about what's going on in the White House. So I think it is important for with Japan and with Australia, a country which is like a second home to me in some ways, so that we can have at least a clarity about where we move with Quad. If it has to be sans United States, or if it has to be with the United States, which will have a weaker presence. Uh, let's decide on the rules of the game. I mean, at the moment, Trump is only interested in terms of money. That as long as you can pay for your own security and you, in some ways, pay for the Quad, he's willing to be a free rider because he thinks that that other allies have free ridden on American security architecture for the last 70 odd years. But if that be so, in any case, I think we need to have a candid conversation about the future of Quad with Japan and Australia, and then with the United States, perhaps three of us together, trying to figure out what is the way ahead.
All right. I can't not ask you. about the Pakistan question. There's Trump's animosity towards India on the one hand, and his dalliance with Pakistan, and particularly its army chief, Asim Munir, on the other. And this happened so soon after the Pahalgam terror attacks. Of course, it's a major sore point for New Delhi. There has been a lot of talk about Trump's personal interest in Pakistan's crypto council, amongst other things. What, according to you, explains Trump's newfound love for Pakistan?
I think with Trump, the equation begins personally. Is there anything for me? So I think there's where the crypto council law begins. The second is, what is it there for me, for my constituents or my larger extended family? So I guess it's also the personal ego being satisfied. Asim Munir was among the first to say that Trump should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So, and the Pakistanis generally have, because it's a small country which can act nimbly, they know how to be sycophants, and they know the art of flattery, because they don't necessarily have that sense of self-esteem as India has. So they're willing to do anything to protect or preserve their interests. So crypto boosting Trump's ego, then the geopolitical reality of the fact that it could probably serve as a gateway, which is Pakistan's greatest strength, its location, to Iran, to the Middle East, to Central Asia, its importance there. And then also the fact that the Pakistani army has a very long-standing relationship with Pentagon, with CENTCOM and other parts of the, and also with state. So that institutional relationship is of a kind which we have never had. Pakistan's, America's deep state has always been in bed with Pakistan's ISI. The final questions about how bin Laden was found out and how that operation was carried out has not been answered. So it's a combination, and of course, in a zero-sum situation where he knows that this is kind of precisely the kind of talk that will alienate India, and if he wants to alienate India, then the surest way is to say, "Oh, Pakistan and India," because the last thing you want to do is be compared or hyphenated with the basket case.
Well, if he wanted to needle and alienate India, I think we can safely say he's been very successful in that. Last couple of questions, Professor Mattu. These are testing times. The 50% tariffs that have been imposed on India could have quite an adverse impact on Indian exports and economy. The India US relationship seems to have hit rock bottom. We live in a very difficult and hostile neighborhood. We had a 100-day military conflict with Pakistan. How do you see India's foreign policy navigating these multiple challenges?
I'm confident that India has the resilience and the strength, and ultimately the tools to be able to navigate through the minefields which you just identified so cogently and clearly. These are amongst the most challenging times that I have known as a foreign policy thinker, analyst, and perhaps a part time practitioner at times. But it will call for all of government approach. It'll call for the really the highest caliber of thinking, strategizing, and let me say that this is something that the government should actually also consult with academia on, because in some ways I think one of the great advantages that we have is we have a robust community of scholars on strategic studies and incisive thinkers on foreign policy, and they should not be siloed out, because ultimately what we all agree on, that India's interests are paramount, and that the Indian journey is unstoppable. And if we can work together, act together, perhaps even this crisis can become, as the Chinese say, an opportunity. And the economists have been talking about how this gives us an opportunity to carry out big bang reforms on land, on labor, on other regulatory uh, measures to ease the doing business in India. If those can happen as a consequence of that, then perhaps there will be, in some ways, this might turn out to be a blessing in disguise. You might remember Trump not particularly in an adversarial fashion, but as a man who helped India really become a great power in the true sense of that word.
Making India great again. And maybe.
Yeah, yeah, maybe you can say that Trump didn't make America great again. He certainly made India great again.
Well, that's certainly an interesting thought. Final question, Professor Mattu, before we let you go. Now, Trump has undoubtedly dealt some very heavy blows to India and the bilateral relationship between the two countries. But some critics have termed recent developments as a failure of India's foreign policy. How do you look at it?
I think you need to do a. I mean, I think there is time to do a mea culpa. What were our mistakes? Did we rely far too much on the United States? Did we invest too much in the American basket? Did we put most of our eggs in that basket? Certainly, the trajectory seemed to suggest that it will be smooth going, and the we had not factored in the unpredictability of President Trump. We didn't have a plan B. Let's put it that way. There wasn't any real contingency planning because you didn't think that a black swan event, if you can describe Trump's presidency as one of that, would be there for us to reckon with so early on in his presidency. So there is undoubtedly a post-mortem and introspection that you need to do. Where did we fail ourselves if we did that? But perhaps now is not the time. Now is not the time to fix blame, apportion blame. Once we get through this crisis, there will be time, and we must find the time to find out what went wrong. But at the moment, we are confronting a crisis. We have to come together as a nation, as a strategic community, to address this huge challenge before us. And it is not a small challenge. After all, losing out on the American market is going to impact India's producers, whether it's at the moment the pharmaceuticals and electronics have not been targeted, but already you're beginning to see the consequences of textiles, jewelry, and other sectors being impacted upon, shrimp industry. So it will, and all of these have multiplier impacts in beyond the specific industries. So it will have an impact on the Indian economy no matter how quickly, how sharply we diversify or we take measures to try and make our exports more competitive. It is a challenging and very serious. It is a serious challenge before us. But I'm confident, as someone who's seen India grow in the 90s and now, that nothing can stop us if we come together as a nation. And I'm sure we will come together as a nation because nothing unites us better when there's a crisis on the nation. And I'm sure across parties, across communities, across the length and breadth of India, we'll come together.
I think one would have to agree with you on that completely because we may be facing a crisis and challenging times, but I think we can agree that Trump has unintentionally united India. He may have divided his own country, but he certainly seems to have united India in this moment of crisis. On that note, Professor Amitabh Mattoo, such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and perspective.